This is Alabama Politics with Steve Flowers, an in-depth interview with Alabama's top political newsmakers. Now, from the studios of Troy University, here is Steve Flowers.
I'm Steve Flowers, and welcome to Alabama Politics. Folks, we're very fortunate tonight to have as our guest one of my best friends in the Alabama government and one of the finest men I've ever seen in state government. I call him young because everybody's younger than me. Young Bill Poole, who is a former state legislator, a prominent state legislator from Tuscaloosa. He was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee for a long time in the state legislature, and now he is Governor Kay Ivey's state finance director. So we have our state finance director, Bill Poole, with us tonight. Bill, good to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Bill and I are old friends. We like to talk politics together, and even though he's young, he's been around it a long time. Well, you're not about 50 years old, are you?
Getting close to 50.
You're
not
not even
quite
50.
there yet.
You're not even 50 years
That's
old.
Right. Not quite there yet.
Bill Poole, you're like a baby. What are you, 48?
I'll take it.
48 years old?
48. You nailed it.
Now, how long have you been finance director now?
About 2.5 years. So approaching my 3rd year anniversary in this role.
Beginning of this quadrennium, were you in her last term, or you were?
I straddled the quadrennium, so I resigned my legislative seat at the end of my last term, so at the end of the last quadrennium, in order to accept this role.
Let's go back now. You represented part of Tuscaloosa, and I always used to be on WVUA in 23, and they get tickled when I talk about your district. I said, that voting place. You still vote at that Church of the Highlands there. I says, I'd be on there with Lynn Brooks, and I'd say, well, that's that silk stocking box out there where all those North River yacht people, Nick Saban and all them live. And she got so tickled. Young people never heard of that saying. You've been around politics. I used to call districts like Mountain Brook and Spring Hill and Mobile silk stocking districts.
Yeah. I'd never heard that till I came over to Montgomery and joined the legislature, and I heard that regularly.
Would they say you were from a silk stocking district?
Well, I heard it mentioned a few times. I laughed. Nobody ever said I worn silk stockings before. That was a new one for me.
You never heard that?
No,
Who used it first with you?
Representative Holmes from here in town.
Oh, is that what he would say?
Yeah.
Alvin had heard it.
Silk stocking Republicans.
Alvin really was my good friend, but he was so loquacious that you couldn't get anything done, with Alvin. And he really didn't want to listen to what you had to say. He'd come over and want to talk to me and ask me a question, then start talking and answering. Would he do that?
He usually did most of the talking.
I know it. But Bill, let's go back to before you represented that silk stocking district in Tuscaloosa. Saban was your constituent, wasn't he?
He was. He sure was. I enjoyed that. Former Senator Shelby was my constituent.
Yeah, Indian Hills in your district
I had
too.
some great. I used to tease him, say I enjoyed meeting with him as my constituent. I'd ask him what I could do for him.
You and I have been friends with Senator Shelby over the years. Yeah. I actually talk with him periodically now. I may have told you this. He'll call me, and he called me the other day, and he says, Shelby's 89 years old, and he's like a 50-year-old. And I said, what you doing, Shelby? And he and Annette lived in that same house in Indian Hills over 55 years. And he said, I'm out in my backyard taking care of a Maltese dog. It's Annette's dog. And I said, well, that's interesting. I said, I want the vultures to get it because some animal will come, it's so small they'll eat it, and they'll be mad at me. Well, I saw Wesley Britt about the next couple of days, and he knew her. Shelby and I were big friends, and we were sitting there at the reapportionment meeting. And he says, have you seen Shelby lately? I said, well, I talked to him yesterday. Actually, I'm talking about some Maltese dog he had. It was Annette's dog, and Wesley looked at it. That's his dog. And next thing, he called me this week, and he told me the same thing. I said, Shelby, what you doing? He said, I want to come up and have supper with you at the Bright Star and bring my friend Hollahan. He's got some man named Hollahan who's a good friend up there. And he said, I'm going to bring Hollahan and we will have supper with you. I said, that's good, Shelby. He said, I'm having to take care of my dog and Annette. They both are taking a lot of my time. But anyway, he sounds as good as he can do. I didn't mean to bore you with that.
No, he's remarkable. I've seen him a few times here recently. It's always good to hear him.
He'll be 90 in May.
Yeah, it's good to see him. It's fun having him around some.
You half his age. Have you thought about that?
Well,
you
half of Shelby's age. I'm not going to tell him that.
48 times 2 is nice. Not really what it's about, though.
Well, Well, I got a lot of catching up to do if I'm going to try to accomplish everything he's accomplished. So he's remarkable.
Back to you. Now, you really weren't born in Tuscaloosa. You were born in Demopolis, weren't you?
I was born out in the country in Marengo County. So, yeah, Demopolis 25 miles away. My parents worked in Demopolis, but I grew up over close to Fawnsdale out in the country.
You know Buddy Bracken?
So this will tell I did know Buddy Bracken, but this will tell you how country we grew up. We didn't like those Demopolis boys in high school because they were the city boys. So
Did you go to Demopolis High School, though?
No, I went to Marengo down over in Linden.
Is that Linden is in Marengo, too?
It is. That's the county seat of Marengo. Smaller than Demopolis, but Demopolis is over on the edge of the county on the river.
Do you know, when you say Fawnsdale, you know Buddy Bracken and I are the same age. We either went to Boys State together or Key Club go. He was governor. Yeah. He was governor of Boys State.
Yeah, I grew up with a couple of his kids.
I think he was governor of Boys State.
Was he?
It was one of those things we went in high school together.
Wouldn't surprise me.
Buddy Bracken, I'll be doggone.
I hadn't heard that name in a while.
From Fawnsdale. But then you finished high school, went to Alabama to school.
I did.
And went straight to law school.
Well, I worked on Capitol Hill for a few years.
That's right.
Between undergraduate and law school. Intended to go for 1 year, enjoyed myself, received some job promotion, so I stayed for 3, then came back for law school.
Did you work for Shelby, or you just worked for
I did. I worked for the House Ways and Means Committee, was my first stop, and then I was promoted and hired by an international trade law firm, so I was monitoring trade legislation for their international clients. And my final stop, some of my prior supervisors at the Ways and Means Committee had moved on to pharma. So my last stop was at pharma for a year, and then I was ready to come back to Alabama.
But you know you were doggone cut out to be finance director and chairman of Ways and Means. Well, you worked for Ways and Means in Washington.
It turned out to be quite a coincidence that I stumbled into that job at Ways and Means in Washington. I didn't understand what a significant opportunity that was at the time, but turned out to be a fantastic experience in one of the more powerful committees in Washington. Yeah. And then find myself, not too long after that in the state legislature on and then chairing the House Ways and Means Committee. So that one kind of came full circle.
You're perfectly suited for that job. Yeah. You're almost like Young Booz is the most perfectly suited state treasurer I've ever seen in my life.
He is suited for it.
I mean, with that background, and banking and everything, I've never seen anybody in that state treasurer's job. I've never seen anybody in finance director.
Well, we're fortunate to have him in
We really are.
He knows what he's doing. He manages a lot of cash, on behalf of the state, and he does a really, really good job. And he chairs a number of boards. The Alabama Trust Fund. He's on the RSA board with me. He brings a lot of knowledge and experience and insight into those roles as well that people don't think about. It's kind of the core treasurer roles. But I call him and ask for advice all the time. He's a real asset to the state.
Brilliant man.
Yep, Stanford graduate.
Stanford graduate. Yeah. Wharton. I think Wharton Business School.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But that wouldn't surprise me.
After Stanford. Yeah. And he was a premier banker. Yeah. He was a banker in California when I first met him.
Well, he's one of those guys that he doesn't have to serve a public service, but he does it because he cares and he does a good job.
Well, so you know the story about his daddy.
I don't know.
Old man Young Boozer, who was the original Young Boozer, or the second one, his daddy played football with Bear Bryant.
Okay.
Young Boozer played on the Rose Bowl team that went out there and beat Stanford.
Oh, no kidding.
They beat Stanford, and then Young grew up in Tuscaloosa.
Well, I knew he had some Tuscaloosa ties.
He went to high school in Tuscaloosa, and what happened was his daddy and Bear Bryant were best friends, and his daddy, the Young Boozer II, intercepted 2 passes against Stanford in that Rose Bowl game in the 1920s, and they beat Stanford out there, which started a tradition, the Rose Bowl. And Bryant played end both ways, and his daddy played defensive back with Dixie Howell.
Really?
Was on that team. And then his daddy, Young Boozer, who played football with Bryant, was in business with Bryant, but superseded Bryant in business. He started Cotton States Life Insurance Company and then sold it to Alpha and made $1 jillion. So you're right, Young was okay financially. Even though he went to Stanford and became a great banker, he also, Young Boozer was in business in the Ziegler plant with Bryant.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was in a lot of business with Bryant, but anyway, I met his daddy when he sold his insurance company to Alpha. He sort of came in here and started lobbying because he had nothing else to do, and his insurance company, Alpha, had bought their insurance company. I didn't mean to get off on that story, but Young Boozer is Young Boozer Third.
He's the third or fourth.
Third. He got a son that's a fourth, and he always kids me. He comes on the show and sits where you are about once a year, and he says, "Steve, if my son has a son, we're gonna name him Young. It'll be Young Boozer the Fifth." He said,
well, that'll just add to some of the funny laughs.
But Bill, after you got through it, you came after you went to up there and worked in the Ways and Means in Washington for 3 or 4 years. Came back to law school then, and then you started practicing in Tuscaloosa right after that.
I did. Opened my practice in Tuscaloosa, which is what I wanted to do. Really went out on my own very early, which here again is what I wanted to do, and enjoyed that practice for probably 5-6 years. And next thing I knew, a legislative seat, a House seat had opened up, and I decided to run for it after some encouragement from some other community leaders. And I think I was 34 at the time. My wife was pregnant with our second child. And
did y'all meet in law school? She's a lawyer too.
We did meet in law school. She was a year behind me in law school.
Where's
she grew
she
up
from?
over in Wetumpka, in Montgomery River region area. And so she was a few years younger than me, also attended the university.
Undergraduate.
And then she worked for Shelby for a year.
I remember that.
And
Shelby tells me every time I talk about you.
That's right. And so then she came in a year behind me in law school. We met in law school.
So she was a year behind you in law school, but she was from Wetumpka. Did she go to undergraduate at Alabama or Auburn?
Undergrad at Alabama.
Alabama,
Yep.
And now y'all have 3 children now.
We have 3 children, Sally, Brother, and Whit. So we're full speed.
Thank y'all for sending my Christmas card. I look forward to it every year. I see their pictures and how they grew. I love people sending their family Christmas cards.
Yeah.
I love it.
It's fun to see all of the families grow up and the kids.
I save them.
It happens fast.
It sure does. I tell you, when you're married, it really does. Yeah. But then you started practicing. When did you and old Tom Watson start having practice together?
I joined with Tom, probably would have been about 2015-ish, 2016, somewhere in there.
Tom Watson is a man about my age, a little older. He's a famous oil and gas lawyer and practiced in Tuscaloosa. And he and Bill had practiced law together there for a long time. How many years did you went to the House at age 34? What year was that?
I ran in the 2010 election, so I came in 2010.
When the House changed?
When the House and the Senate changed.
So you came in with a Republican majority?
That's right, and Governor Riley was ending his term. Governor Bentley was entering.
You took.
We had that special session that was unusual, and so came in 2010 with that wave, so to speak.
I had forgotten about that special session prior to 2010. I may have told you, I'm writing Jabbo Wagner's biography, and that came up in the book, how we were writing the history, and he brought this up about that they'd been in the minority so long, and Riley had been governor with a majority Democratic Senate, so there were some things they wanted to pass for Riley, and so they met there right before even before organization.
Yeah, we prevailed in the election in November, and the next thing you know, as a new member, we were in a special session under the then governor. The new governor hadn't been sworn in. We hadn't even had an organizational session, and went straight into a special session, which was fine. And we got some good stuff done in that session, but it was certainly a unique time. I don't know that that's ever happened.
Bill, when you first got there in 2010, did you go on Ways and Means immediately?
I did. Ways and Means, Education, so Education Appropriations and Judiciary were my primary assignments.
So you on both those initially.
But having worked on the Hill in D.C. and worked in a committee capacity, I knew how important those committee assignments were. So I lobbied aggressively to land in those roles. Hubbard was the speaker.
Hubbard was speaker, and then how long was Hubbard speaker for?
He must have left in 14-ish, 15-ish maybe.
Well, now how many years did you serve? From 12 or 16?
I served 11 years in the legislature.
Last of your third term.
I gave up my 12th year. Would have finished my 3rd term.
So in your second term after 2014 election, from that Tuscaloosa seat, you had already been on House Ways and Means, Education, and Judiciary. Did you become chairman in your second term?
I became chairman in my first term.
Are you serious?
I became chairman in the 3rd year of my first term.
The then
chairman, Jay Love from here in Montgomery.
He ran for Congress.
He had actually run in 10, but he resigned from the legislature.
Just quit the legislature.
So the chairmanship came open, and in my third year
became chairman
of the first term, I was named chairman of that Appropriations Committee.
Have you ever heard about being chairman of Ways and Means your first term?
I haven't, and it was a pretty significant, trust that Speaker Hubbard provided in me, and it was very meaningful to me. I took the role very seriously. It was challenging to be in that position in the first term of a legislative service, but I had served on the committee for a couple years at that point. I had worked hard. I took my role seriously. We had had some hard issues in that time. People forget back then the education budget was in a very difficult position. The legislature had to cut almost $1 billion out of that budget. So those were not pleasant times from a budget standpoint. And I had participated in working through some of those hard decisions that had to be made, and in doing so learned a lot about the budget process. And so ultimately ascended to that chairmanship.
In your first term. So when you came back in 2014, you were chairman again. By being chairman of Ways and Means, as a budget chairman, you don't have time to be on another committee, though, can you?
No, I gave up my judiciary seat at that point, and I really did focus exclusively on my responsibility as chairman of the Appropriations
It was
Committee.
well known how well thought of you were. And I wrote about it in my columns over the years. If you remember how much people thought of you. Matter of fact, if you ask somebody during the era you were in the legislature, beginning with your first term, and especially your second and third terms in 14, after the 14 quadrennium and then the 18 quadrennium, if you ask anybody on the Hill in the legislature who is the best legislator or the most astute and most respected legislator, you were first on everybody's list. The entire time, I'd say from the 10 years you became chairman of Ways and Means, if you ask anybody, lobbyists or legislators, or anybody observed government, I'm not saying this to flatter you, I'm just telling you, I may have written that if you ask somebody, say, what do you think is most qualified and does the best job as a legislator? Bill Poole. I mean, and people liked you too in the legislature.
Well, that's kind. I took my term very seriously.
Yeah.
I grew up in rural Alabama. It meant a lot to me to try to fulfill my responsibility to improve the state of Alabama. I worked on some really hard issues. I took on some issues that other people didn't want to take on a few times, but they were issues that had to be tackled and dealt with. So I enjoyed that work, the complexities of working with the group of legislators to try to solve some of those problems. And I think we solved a few. I think we did some good things.
Well, who was finance director for you?
Finance director before me was Kelly Butler.
And he was a career employee. He did a good job.
He did a great job. Kelly was a fantastic.
He was he retired.
He did, had some health issues and retired, but highly regarded.
He really was.
Big shoes to fill.
He really was. And that was kind of unusual. My years growing up observing Alabama politics, when Wallace was governor, he wouldn't pick a unqualified crony, but you had to be kind of a political crony and not a career finance director, because the finance director has always been the premier and most important job in any governor's administration all my life.
Well, it's a very significant role. I think very few people really understand all of the functions and responsibilities of the finance department. I understood it fairly well going into the job, but I've learned a lot through the process as well. But it is a critical role. It really serves as the nexus of all decisions and investments that involve state government in any capacity. And so advising the governor, protecting the state's financial interests, it's a very significant role. And, if you make mistakes, you get some things wrong, then the consequences are pretty substantial. So, it requires somebody that can go in and really keep focus on what are the important objectives and successfully execute those.
Yeah. Well, it's always been, all my lifetime of following Alabama politics, it's always been the premier cabinet position. And even when Wallace and them would pick a political friend, more or less, there was a political appointment, they would pick somebody who wasn't going to steal any money or wasn't going to be out there, trying to embarrass them. They had, or knew what they were doing anyway.
Right.
It wouldn't be some guy who worked in the campaign that could yell the loudest or something.
Yeah. Well, you need somebody who can understand politics and policy and finance.
Which is the perfect thing for you. You're almost descriptive for that job. Was it a tough decision to leave your law practice and take that job? Because it's not you don't get any retirement as a political appointment, doesn't it?
No, it was a tough decision. I had built my law practice for 17 years. I enjoyed practicing law. But I also had progressed through my political responsibilities and public service. I had taken on a number of issues, and it was time for me to take on another challenge. After then, I think 8 years as the budget chairman, 11 in the legislature. Another term for me would have been 16 years in the legislature. So I felt like it was time for me either to return to my law practice and focus on it, or find another role that I could contribute to the state. And this role came along kind of at a time that I was trying to determine and think about those things and what was in the best interest of my family. And here again, how I could contribute to the state. So I've enjoyed it.
Perfect timing for the state and for you. Let's talk about the thing. You kind of come in at a pretty good time for the state finances.
Well, state finances are in a good position, and it certainly sometimes is challenging managing that, but that's better than the challenge of not having or having to reduce budgets. But the state is in very, very sound fiscal financial position right now. So it is interesting to see it in this capacity. I think I could argue pretty persuasively that the state is in its best fiscal position maybe in the history of the state.
I don't think there's any doubt about it.
No, I don't think there is either. It is fairly remarkable. We've paid down debt. We've bolstered our reserves to historical levels. The budgets are both in very sound position. We have underappropriated relative to revenues, which means we have some slack should we see an economic downturn resulting in a reduction of revenues. So I'm very pleased with where the state is right now.
I think you should be, because it is. However, I am seeing or hearing reports that the growth is slowing down a little bit, because all the state economy and that whole national economy are tied together, and there's cycles. You know, you kind of have up and down. Projections are that we're going to have to tighten our belt. We've been living in some pretty luxurious times with the COVID money and the economy boosting. But the projections are it's going to be a leveling off. Is that what you're seeing?
Well, I think what we're seeing is a return to some level of normalcy. We've seen just incredibly robust revenue growth over a few years, and that's been some degree artificially fueled by the COVID relief funds, a variety of other federal money. But what we're also seeing is unemployment's at record low levels. We have more Alabamians working now than ever before, so income tax payments are up. For better or worse, primarily worse for households, but when inflation increases the cost of the goods you buy, as a consequence of that, you pay more sales tax.
That's right.
So sales tax revenues are up for state and local governments all over the country. So we've seen these kind of spikes that are unsustainable in terms of year-over-year revenue. For instance, our general average year-over-year increase in revenue in the Education Trust Fund budget, which is primarily your income and sales tax revenue, is about 3.5% to 4%. We had successive years north of 20%.
Wow.
That's never happened before.
So normal is 3 to 4%.
Yeah, never happened before. I doubt will ever happen again. But what we have now seen is revenue in the education budget is flat as a pancake right now. So that doesn't mean it's reduced. That just means it's really starting to correct and return to some normalcy. So I think we're pleased with what we're seeing kind of generally. We'll see if the revenue levels decrease year over year or kind of modify or stay close to that kind of new high watermark, so to speak. But again, we have built in ample slack to absorb a revenue downturn of a reasonable amount on the education side. The general fund is healthy as well. You know, after many years of being very stagnant, the legislature very wisely, I think, moved some growth tax revenue over to the general fund. The general fund is also benefiting from some increased interest on state deposits, which I won't get all into the technicals of that. That's probably not sustainable either, but we're benefiting from that on the general fund side right now as well. But I do think we're going to see our budgets flatten out. I think in the years ahead, you know, cycles are going to occur. You're going to have good times, you're going to have bad times. And I think positioning the state to be able to absorb any revenue or financial difficulties is the objective, and I think we've done a good job of that.
When you say leveling off, it's not going below where the 20% growth has been. It's going to be just leveling off where we are now.
That's what we're seeing right now. Now, it could decline slightly, but in the scheme of things, that really is not a revenue reduction if you think about it within a relatively recent spectrum of time. So, but we're watching that closely. And there's some anomalies out in the economy right now. We continue to see a lot of federal money still pushing through the economy, but it's starting to wind down. You're seeing a lot of things occur around the world right now that could be disruptive as it relates to what is a global economy, whether we like it or not. And Alabama has really become a player in that with the port, with other business activities, international automakers here. So those global impacts can be felt in Alabama in a way maybe they weren't before. So we have to consider those risks as we manage state revenues and investments.
Well, you know, one thing, and I guess this is your legacy too, is, you know, for years and years, when I was in legislature, we'd have proration. You know, when the Republicans took over and you took over Chairman of Ways and Means about simultaneous with the Republican Party, y'all have done a very good, prudent job of not overspending, of spending with prudency, and also putting reserves in there.
Yeah, it's really been remarkable. It's really been remarkable. We haven't had proration in the state since 2011. That's the longest time since we basically formed the ETF, which is remarkable. But we've also, you know, to my knowledge, there's never been a reserve fund for the general fund. And we now have a historical level of funding in the general fund reserve. We have reserves in the education budget, understanding the volatility of those income and sales tax revenues. So we've paid down and reduced debt. So we've put the state in a very sound fiscal position. And I think there are two examples that kind of validate that. One is what you've seen during some of these odd economic times is the big credit agencies, your S&Ps, your Moody's. They run stress tests on states, so they predict if we have a 5% recession or a 7%, how would the states fare? Alabama fares generally in the top 10 on all of those stress tests, which indicate we have not overspent, we have paid down debt, we've bolstered reserves, and we've improved the financial position of the state. In that regard, we're actually having some preliminary conversations with the credit agencies about whether the state is in a position at this point to receive a credit upgrade, which would be a remarkable accomplishment for the state of Alabama. Some of the fundamentals that the credit agencies look at have been challenging for us as a rural state for a period of time, but we've strengthened our fiscal position to such a degree, and our economy has grown to such a degree that we're moving into a position to have that discussion with the credit agency. So here again really speaks to the management of the state, the economic growth of the state, how much our economy has grown, whether it's in the automotive sector, Huntsville in North Alabama, the port in South Alabama. You can just look around the state and see so much activity, and that's really enabled these opportunities.
Well, you're a major part of it. I hate to tell you, our time's up, Bill. Folks, our guest tonight has been State Finance Director Bill Poole, who's been an integral part of putting Alabama in good financial position as Chairman of Ways and Means in the House for 12 years before he became Finance Director. And we thank Bill for being our guest tonight. We thank you viewers for watching. Hope you tune in again next week for Alabama Politics. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Steve.
Appreciate it, buddy.
Thank you.